Okie dokie. So we are live. Um, Quite a fair few things to talk about this afternoon. We've obviously had the French Open tennis and some weather delays. So the women's semi-finals are done. Nadal has beaten Federer in straight sets. So there's interesting things going on in the French Open tennis. But on the flip side, the UEFA Nations League is taking place. England are out, standard, and Holland will be playing Portugal. Both semi-finals with 3-1 scores. Got the Women's World Cup kicking off this evening between France and South Korea, and then England play Scotland on the Sunday. But there's been a lot of debate in the build-up to the Women's World Cup and in the men's game about pay disparity. And there's been a lot of debate about should women get paid as equal to their male counterparts. And the issue with that is not necessarily that they don't put the training in, they don't play hard and try their best. It will bankrupt the women's game. Plain and simple. We've seen it with women's ice hockey. They tried a professional league in Canada, and it's out of business. It wasn't making any money. And when you're averaging a couple hundred people per game, it's not sustainable. And the debate about women have to get paid the same amount as men in the women's game bankrupt it. Absolutely bankrupt it. And that's a big issue going on at the moment. Obviously, we have the Israel Folau ongoing saga with Israel Folau and Rugby Australia. He's now threatening to sue them for up to 10 million Australian dollars, and that could bankrupt Rugby Australia if they lose. And people are going, well, he's suing them for the attack on freedom of religion, blah, 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 blah. But at the end of the day, he's in breach of contract. So that's an interesting one about to see what happens with Israel Folau. He didn't decide to take up a second panel of code of conduct hearing with a different 3-person panel. He decided to take up the legal action. And it shows the greed of the man, though, and his father apparently is involved heavily with advising him and leading him down the choice to pursue legal action. There was a peace offering on the table. There were discussions on the table, and his father said no, turned the offer down. So is Israel Folau being led by his father? A little bit. Is Rugby Australia being very reactive and not proactive? Absolutely, because the RFU and Billy Vanapola proved that you can sit down with a player and thrash things out in a calm, considered, proactive way. So that's going to be interesting. On the Newcastle takeover, well, we haven't really heard anything since it was announced that Sheikh Khalid was handing over proof of funds. So nothing's really happened with Mike Ashley at all. But there's now rumours circulating that he wants to take over Game. He's got a 38% stake in Game, and there's rumours circulating that he wants to, bring Game under his company umbrella, which I don't want to happen personally. I've got friends who work for the company, and I know what his business practices are like with how he treats his staff. But all these business takeovers and attempted takeovers, it looks like he has to sell Newcastle or sell one of his other businesses to make money. The big issue is, and it's been regularly overlooked, is the ongoing tax fraud investigation. And he might have opened up a holding company, but that could mean he wants to merge, is it Debenhams or House of Fraser fully with Sports Direct. So just because he's opened up a holding company, he owns a variety of businesses in this country, from Sports Direct through to Newcastle United. He owns a variety of businesses. The issue with this takeover, Sheikh Khalid, just because he's opened up a holding company, his cousin is Man City owner. So there could be a whole variety of reasons. And the corporate tax laws, you could open up a holding company to basically funnel money through and avoid paying tax. It happens a lot. You just have to look at Google and Amazon, how they put up holding companies in Ireland to avoid the tax rate here. So opening up a holding company doesn't necessarily suggest that a takeover is actually happening. And he failed last year to buy Liverpool because he couldn't have proof of funds. So the issue that I think is being overlooked is not that Sheikh Khalid attempted to buy Liverpool and he's and Sheikh Mansour's cousin. It's the ongoing tax fraud investigation, and everyone overlooks that. It's been going on for over 2 years now. Newcastle United have been, their offices have been raided, their trading grounds have been raided, documents have been seized, officials have been arrested, questioned. So this tax fraud investigation isn't going away, and people aren't talking about it or don't want to talk about it, or they overlook it. And I think that's very, very important, because we've seen 2 other takeover bids for similar amounts of money, in around the 300 to 350 million pound mark, under Amanda Staveley and Peter Kenyon fizzle out. And they may still be on the table. And we are aware of what's been released publicly, that there's at least 2 other bids that are active. Not just shakily, this may be the furthest along, but there are 2 other bids active. And the whole thing stinks a little bit to high heaven. The fact is the club's been up for sale for over 2 years, and no progress has been made with a sale. Either Mike Ashley's asking too much. He might be asking, saying, look, can Sports Direct still be one of the stadium sponsors? And I don't think Amanda Staveley or Peter Kenyon wanted that. I think they wanted a clean break from Mike Ashley. And this ongoing tax fraud investigation, does that mean the new owner is liable for any unpaid tax bills, any legal costs? There's a whole host of things going on that are very complex and that we don't necessarily understand. And it wouldn't surprise me if Mike Ashley doesn't end up selling, but the situation has got to a point now where this is the 3rd time, this time round of the club being up for sale. He's attempted at least 6 times to sell this club. He tried to sell the club within 2 years of buying it. He wanted to make a quick buck. It didn't work. He's got lumbered with it. Obviously, the economic crash that happened in 2008, 2009 has an effect on that, because he bought the club and wanted to flip it really quickly. It didn't work out so well. They got relegated, and the value of the club has actually declined under his watch. So I don't know what's going on here fully, but from everything I've read and all the sources and the gossip I've seen and the various information that I can get, the feedback from fans, a lot of fans are clinging to the belief that he's going to sod off. The issue with that is there's got to be a clean break, but the issue is the ongoing tax investigation, and I think that's being overlooked in this whole situation. Because as soon as the tax investigation involved West Ham and Chelsea, Chelsea's plans for a new stadium have gone up in smoke, and Abramovich wants out, but he can't find a buyer for the club. They're facing a transfer embargo. There's all sorts going on with Chelsea. West Ham, they've had issues with their owners doing dodgy things as well. So this tax fraud investigation that involves 3 English clubs with some very suspicious ownership practices, and fans. I'm not 100% certain what's going to happen with Newcastle United, but a deal needs to be done soon, because the transfer window's, I think, now open. We need, as football fans, as sports fans, as a wider kind of thing. And I work with a Newcastle season ticket holder. He's moved down south, and I work with a Geordie, and he wants it done. So I actually know people from the northeast, and they want Ashley gone. Same with like Sunderland fans. They've been badly done as well with some of the ownership they've had. Hull, their fans are not happy with the ownership at Hull. So the teams of the northeast, all of them have really bad owners, and they're not in a position where they should be. They've been badly run. There's a breakdown of the relationship between the owner and the fans. And the issue with Newcastle fans is this, and I can't fault them for their loyalty, but that's the issue. They're too loyal. If they started boycotting games en masse, that would have a massive effect on Newcastle United, because they're heavily reliant on the fans turning up for their funds, for their profits. If Newcastle United fans stay away, that would hit Mike Ashley really severely. And that might speed up the process. We've seen it with Blackpool. Blackpool managed to get the Oyston family out by staying away. But at the same time, I'm just trying to read through these comments that are coming through. But at the same time, the Newcastle United fan base, while they are loyal, and I do appreciate their loyalty is actually harming them. If they were to mass protest and stay away, and if there was enough empty seats at Newcastle United, I think Mike Ashley might go, I need to get out of here, because it would hurt him in his pocket. He's a businessman that makes money, because for all his negativity, people just can't quite boycott his businesses. They continue to shop at Sports Direct because it's cheap. They continue to go to his outlets because of the value that is given to the customer with the end product. He sells sports gear cheaper than JJB, DW, Foot Locker, a whole variety of other sports stores that may sell shoes or sports gear. Decathlon. He sells things cheaper, much cheaper, and that's why people go, because compared to his market competitors, he is cheaper. And while I no longer shop at Sports Direct, not enough people are boycotting his businesses. He's a businessman that will feel it in the pocket. We've seen what's happened with Sir Philip Green with all his negativity. If consumers took the same, and this is Newcastle fans as well, if they took the same kind of mentality of we're staying away, which is something Newcastle fans will never do. That's the problem. He might sell up, but I have concerns that this deal's going to collapse like the previous two. Both the previous two bids, they have been involved. I mean, Amanda Staveley was involved in Sheikh Mansour's successful takeover and a lengthy takeover bid for Liverpool the season before. So she actually isn't not clueless when it comes to football. She was very clued up. She's done she's done her homework, basically. He called her a Mickey Mouse out of her depth, which doesn't endear him to future bids. Peter Kenyon involved with Chelsea and Man United for over 20 years, footballing mind, really knows how the business model works and what fans expect of a club. Turned him down. A guy with a bid in a failed bid for Liverpool couldn't prove proof of funds. Somehow this bid's got further. I don't get it. But the lack of news on it is what's worrying me. And I don't know. I think we've had so many broken. How should I put it? Broken promises from Mike Ashley in relation to this club that the Newcastle fan base has just got to a point now where they want him gone. And the fact that very early on in the ownership, he lost the trust of the fans when he tried to sell the club after 2 years. He hasn't really had the fans on side for over a decade. And the only way you're going to get real change at Newcastle is to boycott games. The thing is, it's the off-season now. It's the summer. So that doesn't work. But for a Premier League club, Newcastle is more heavily reliant on ticket sales than others because they're not in Europe. They haven't been in Europe for a while. And the fan base is so loyal, they will sell merchandise. Doesn't matter that the shirt design doesn't really change. It's black and white stripes. But they will always sell merchandise. They will always sell tickets. But that's how heavily reliant they are on the fan base. They're more heavily reliant on the fan base than TV rights over other clubs. Other clubs milk the money because they're in Europe. They're in the Europa and Champions League. Newcastle haven't been in Europe for a while. So it's one of them. It's a difficult one to really, contemplate. I'm not a Newcastle fan, but I have an affinity with the Northeast. I've got a lot of friends from the Northeast. I've always had a soft spot for Newcastle, especially in the 90s when they gave it to Man United for 2 seasons and Arsenal and were close to win the Premier League and winning the FA Cup a couple of times. And they were one of the bigger clubs in English football. Now is not the case, but it's one of them. We've seen so many clubs badly run over the last 10, 20 years. It's becoming more common. And the fit and proper persons test that the FA and the Football League and the Premier League, put in place is a joke test because look at the amount of owners that clearly are not suitable to be football club owners that have had club ownership in the last 20 years. It boggles belief how the governing bodies, the powers that be, put these things in place and then don't enforce them. So I don't know. Well, it'll be like the proof will be in the pudding. If anything happens, it's normally a 14 to 21 day process. So if Sheikh Khalid is definitely serious and Mike Ashley wants to take the man's money, it normally takes about 2 to 3 weeks. The fact we've heard nothing for a couple of days now, it is the weekend. It's that kind of Women's World Cup's on, the UEFA Nations League. There's World Cup qualifiers that have started to take place. There are other things happening in football. It's sort of a bit of a downtime for football. There's no major transfers happening yet, apart from maybe Eden Hazard's transfer, but that's not fully complete yet. So it's this point in football where it's really a bit of a period where not a lot happens. I wouldn't be surprised if there's a lot of negotiations going on, but at the same time, it's one of them. Mike Ashley's so unpredictable. He's one of those guys who was so unpredictable to read. But if this is unresolved going into the new season, the St James's Park needs to have empty seats. It needs to have fans staying away for the message to get across that we don't want this guy as an owner anymore. But at the same time, I mean, so many So many clubs have been badly run. It's unreal. We've seen Notts County fall out of the Football League. We've seen Bolton Wanderers and all the issues they've got. There's issues in Scotland with clubs like Rangers. It's an ongoing bleeding sore of finance issues off the field. And Mike Ashley's got given money to Rangers. So the ownership of football clubs is a big discussion point, and we've had this discussion so many times over the last year on the channel to do with football ownership and who owns clubs and how much say fans have and ticket prices and overinflated wages and transfers. And the debate doesn't go away. It continues to, it's a revolving question. I think fans have started to basically have enough. And it's not just football fans, it's fans of all sports across the board have had enough with subscription TV, pay-per-views. The fact that more people watched Ruiz Jr. knock out Anthony Joshua than actually paid to watch it says that the fans have had enough of being ripped off. Sports consumers have basically had enough of being priced out. And there's starting to be a backlash against the greedy milking the cow, the people who promote the promoters, the owners of teams, the way leagues are structured financially. There's a backlash coming. And I think the average fan has had enough of being milked for everything they're worth over the last 10, 20 years. I think we're reaching a point now where the money bubble's got to burst. And we'll have to see. I mean, at the end of the day, we've seen the two very disappointing European Cup finals for various reasons. And I think the tipping point has reached now when it comes to pro sport and the amount of money we as viewers on TV or fans are willing to pay. There's a point where it's got too corporate. The high wages that professional sportsmen get paid, especially in team sports, the prize money that individual athletes like tennis players and boxers and UFC fighters at the top end get paid, and the wage disparity between the top levels and the lower levels and men and women, the money bubble is starting to run its course, and fans, not just here in the UK but across the world, are saying enough's enough, and it's starting to become this ongoing, argument that we've had enough. And if people start voting with their wallets and their feet and start not paying for the pay-per-views and subscription services, the people that run them will take note and go, we need to change our business model because we need to make money somehow. And if those people who are our customer base are turning off, we need to look at how we engage with them. And Mike Ashley, for example, has lost that trust between fan and him. The relationship's broken down, the consumer and the business. And he's one of those businessmen that will feel the pinch in his pocket. But the takeover, I don't know. It's one of them. The fact that he's had the club up for sale for so long, and he's on the third serious bid, and he's been really the way he's dealt with the previous two hasn't gone down well. It's an interesting one to see what will actually happen. But we've been here before with Mike Ashley. He's so unpredictable. And this guy failed to take over Liverpool because he couldn't have proof of funds. So it's an interesting one. Whether it works out in the end or not, we'll have to wait and see. But looking at how fans are reacting to sport at the moment and the money in it, and how they, as the end consumer, are feeling ripped off, undervalued, and not listened to, I think we're reaching a turning point across the board, and we've seen it with the greed of some of these athletes and the greed of some of these owners as it's a tipping point. And and now the female athletes want equal pay, and if they get equal pay, a lot of sports will be bankrupted, and a lot of teams will go out of business, and a lot of athletes will lose jobs, and fans will be the ones who end up paying. And the Women's World Cup has been a big debating point. A lot of people don't want to watch women's football, and that's fair enough. But the England women's team have a very good chance of winning this tournament, and they have worked so hard to make the game professional in this country. And the amount of crap they get on social media, and this is what's happened a lot over the last 10 years, is the amount of abuse and harassment that people get on social media now is unbelievable. And they fought hard to make their sport professional, very hard. And it is only fair that they have the debate about, closing the pay gap, or, I don't know, increasing the pay for women, or improving that kind of the financial side of the game. But if they were to get automatically equally paid alongside the men, the women's game is bankrupt within days. So that debate's, ongoing, and has been ongoing for, a couple of years now. It's been more heightened in the last few months in the build up to the Women's World Cup. And then talking about finance, you look at the Rugby World Cup and the fact that the World Rugby wants to change the structure of how the international game is played and the world ranking system. And the way they want to change it doesn't benefit the up and coming nations. It only benefits a couple of federations, and that's again where the money goes. So money in sport is a very interesting debating point at the moment. But it's all I've linked this all into one point. I've managed to link in several sports into the Newcastle takeover. I really waffled a little bit, but it's basically the principle of the money in sport. That the owners and the players want to get wealthier, and the fans are the ones who end up paying, even though we have all these stupid TV deals. And I think there's going to come a point where free-to-air TV and free streaming, is the way to go again, because the subscription service, less people are subscribing. The pay-per-views, more people find illegal ways to watch. The Anthony Joshua fight proves that. And the backlash against BT and Sky is growing daily. And they keep raising the subscription fee unless people want to watch. That's their reactions. Oh, less people are watching. Let's keep raising the prices, and then you put more people off, and it's a revolving cycle. Then it doesn't help anyone. And if Sky and BT were to suddenly hit financial difficulties, or BT is in financial difficulties, being propped up by the parent company, a lot of professional sports are in serious trouble because they become heavily reliant on the TV money. And it's the whole debate's interesting, it's one of them. I've managed to waffle a little bit, but the Newcastle takeover especially is a symptom of the disease that is high-profile professional sport. The greed of the owners, the greed of the players, the overinflated wages, the whole thing, the money gravy train has got to stop at some point. The bubble has got to burst, because the insane growth of professional sports in the last 25 years and the money in it, how well has that, how much has that, transcended into the amateur ranks, the lower levels? How much has sport benefited? How much have communities benefited? And I would say probably not a lot. I don't think professional sport has benefited as much as it should have. And I think there's a lot of issues when it comes to where the money goes, where's the money coming from, ticket prices, TV rights, the whole lot. You just have to look at the sports that I prefer watching in my favourite sports video that I did last year, and you look at that and you go, this is why he likes this sport, this is why he dislikes this sport. And yeah, I think football is one of those sports that has reached a point now where there are issues with the TV rights, there are issues with club ownership, there are issues with overinflated wages and salaries and bonuses and transfers and all sorts, and it's getting to become a very toxic, badly governed, corrupt greed fest that's turned the game into just a mess. I don't know what else I can really say on that. I think it's going to be interesting what happens with Mike Ashley and Newcastle and football in general. There's a lot of clubs that are in a similar situation where the owner has completely lost the fan base. There are issues with the ongoing future of clubs, and some clubs are in real trouble. You just have to look at Bolton Wanderers as an example, and what's happened to them. You have to look also to Sunderland, Charlton, Notts County, the Venkeys at my club, Blackburn. The issue with club ownership and who gets to run a club and all this kind of stuff in this country is a big talking point, and I think fans have had enough. They've honestly been let down by the governing body, the EFL, the FA, the Premier League. They've been let down across the board. It is what it is. It's not a good state of affairs that we find ourselves in 2019. The false promises we were given 25 years ago, 26 years ago with subscription sport, with Sky Sports have proven to be false, and the greed has killed the joy of the sport. It's had a knock-on effect. But enough on that. Let's focus on other things. The Women's World Cup, kicks off tonight in France. This is the second major tournament France has had in 3 years. That I think is going to be fun. I think I'm going to enjoy watching the Women's World Cup. I think they do get a negative press a lot of the time, or underreported press, and I think it's time to show the men how the game is played. I think the women, the debate about equal pay and everything is an interesting one, but I do honestly think that when it comes to women's football, this is a great opportunity to showcase what they can do, and the passion and the drive and the energy they have. And the skill level is not the same, the quality level is not the same, but the passion's there and the willingness is there. I do think they need to get more recognition from mainstream media. The Netherlands getting test status. The Dutch have been playing one day in T20 cricket for a long time. I think with countries like Bangladesh that are far further ahead than them, and Ireland and Afghanistan getting that test status before, even though the Netherlands have been to more World Cups and more T20 tournaments and more World Championships and things like that, I think the Dutch do like playing cricket. They play a lot of sports that we don't realise they play. There's a big connection with British sports and the Dutch. There really is. There's a long-standing connection between British sports and the Dutch, be it rugby union, rugby league, cricket, ice hockey. A lot of sports that we sort of took over there post World War II and maybe World War I as well. There's a lot of interlinked things there, and while they may not be at the same standard as other European nations and other world nations in certain sports, they do play them, and they are playing them pretty religiously. It's just the quality level isn't quite there. But no, I think it's a good thing. I think growing the game is great. The issues are, again, the TV rights for cricket have been an ongoing issue since 2005 in this country. The lack of accessibility, the fact the World Cup is only on Sky and a crappy highlights package is on Channel 4, that doesn't endear ICC or the ECB to the cricket fan base. It's not a great way to grow the game. I've seen very little advertising for the Cricket World Cup. I've seen more adverts for the Women's World Cup in football, and that says something. And I think there's going to come a point where the TV model has to change. It has to become free to air again. You have to get rid of these subscription channels and make those channels free, because again, the debate comes in. But no, it's great for the Netherlands to get that status. I will admit it is great for the Dutch to get that recognition. They've worked very, very hard, and they've been very competitive at the lower levels of cricket for a very, very long time, and they've been very decent as one day and T20 sides, and they've produced one or two pretty solid cricketers who've played county level or that domestic cricket level around the world in places like South Africa and Australia. They have produced one or two really solid domestic cricket, kind of that 4-day cricket level player. So much like the Irish, much like the Afghans, who've had, especially the Afghans, who've had a real whirlwind growth of the game, and Bangladesh, I think it's well deserved that they get to that level, because I think it's vitally important that the game continues to grow, because it's a sport played in summer, and there's very few sports that they can compete with it when it comes to professional level for fan base at that time of year. But at the same time, the infrastructure needs to be put in place. They need to make sure they have a development program and that they can actually improve more and become as competitive as possible in the test arena, because otherwise it's just it does nothing to help the game if they're getting battered in test series all the time. I think if they were to have like a test series against Afghanistan and Ireland and that kind of level, maybe Bangladesh and Zimbabwe, I think that will give them a basis to kick on and play teams like Sri Lanka, like New Zealand, like England, like Australia, like Pakistan, like India, some of those better test sides, and they can get better. But it's a great starting point. and just let's see where it goes from here. I think you've got to start somewhere. I think the way cricket is organised is very archaic when it comes to test status. I do think it's very, very archaic. I think other sports, they just have internationals. It's just about how I think the way cricket is organised is very outdated and archaic. But at the same time, when you get given that status, it is a status symbol saying you've made it to the elite group. And it's good to see that the ICC is finally recognising these what I class as second tier kind of nations that are on the periphery and actually giving the opportunity for them to play Test cricket. I think, but I think the way cricket is organised has to change. I think there has to be a way of looking at and sitting around a table and looking at changing the structures of international cricket. I think that has to be looked at, and I think the fans have to be open to change as well. Positive change, not the 100 format, but looking at maybe evolving Test cricket, one days and T20, and sort of coming up with a one form of the sport across all levels. I think that will go a long way into improving the game and the sport long term. I think there has to be a dialogue between the governing bodies, the players, the fans, the coaches, the media partners, the sponsors. I think everyone needs to get around a table and constructively improve the state of the sport and the organisation of the sport and the way it all works. I think, but we'll see what happens. We have to see what happens. I think it's going to be a very interesting future, not just for the Dutch cricket, but for the sport in general. We're going through a really interesting phase with the 100 format, which no one seems to want apart from the ECB, and it's going to be an interesting phase for the sport over the next 5-10 years. We have to. The cricket governing bodies have to get things right. If they don't get it right, they risk damaging the sport at a time when its future's in the balance about the direction it takes. But we'll have to see what happens at the end of the day. The Dutch are a sporting nation. Let's not hide away from that. They have a lot of athletes in a lot of sports. They really value their sportsmen more. I think the way they develop youngsters in the various professions and actually get them to the top level, the way the Dutch do it is far better than over here in the UK. I think the UK has an issue with not enough youngsters participating in sport, and those that do think they're going to be world class athletes from day one, when a lot of them will be pretty just solid and uninspiring, but solid athletes. So we have to make sure that we as a nation also improve our youth systems and getting more kids involved actively. And there's a whole host of reasons and ways to do that. But it's going to be interesting for the Dutch going forward. It's good to see though. On a rugby union, obviously the Israel Folau. So let's go back to Israel Folau. He's now contemplating suing Rugby Australia, but Rugby Australia is going down the toilet. I think the way they've dealt with the last 2.5 years at the top, with Riley Castle running the organisation and some of the decisions they've taken, is the direction that Australian Rugby Union is taking is a worrying one. I don't know if not only are they going to be competitive at the World Cup, but the future of player development, competitiveness, Super Rugby in general is in doubt. Because if Israel Folau wins his lawsuit, Rugby Australia is broke. It's done. It's done. And the fact that the Western Force could not be kept going in Super Rugby, but they can give all that money to Israel Folau, but not to the Western Force, is one of the most baffling decisions I think that has ever been taken by a governing body ever out of a centralised funding pot. Is to pay one player the equivalent of an entire squad of players is baffling in the extreme. And you've lost Nick Cummings, the honey badger, to the Australian Wallabies. You've lost Nick Cummings to Rugby Union. That's how baffling the decision is. Now, Nick Cummings is a heart and soul guy. He may not be the most skillful player out there, but my God, he's a heart and soul guy, and he shows far more commitment than many professionals out there. Real fun to watch, fun character, but that's been lost to the game. That's been lost to Australian Rugby Union. Nick Cummings is now a TV celebrity. future career choice is irrelevant, to be honest. But one of my favourite players is no longer playing the game at the top level because of the decision to axe his team, pretty much, and not sort out the funding formula needed for Rugby Australia and Western Force to have a coherent and successful partnership. I think they've really gone about it the wrong way. And State of Origin in Rugby League's been played in Perth. It's game 2. So I think Rugby League's got it right. They're looking at the Western Australian market. Rugby Union, it's Super Rugby as a whole has been really badly run. It favours the New Zealand sides, the Kiwi sides. That means the Kiwis have a stronger playing pool for selection because they have 5 teams. South Africa's an interesting one because they've got 2 teams in the Pro 14, but they've got 3 teams in Super Rugby. But yeah, the Sunwolves decision baffles me as well. I think that's a kick in the teeth, considering 6 months out from the World Cup, they announced they're getting dropped. That's not good. They weren't given a shout, really. Just when they started to become more competitive, I think that's an absolute joke. But the Japanese domestic competition is really actually quite strong. It's in a good, healthy position. They have a professional league in Japan. It may not be at the highest level, but they do. The players get paid a decent wage. There is a professional league, and it is there. And their best players play in that league. They choose not to play for the Sunwolves. That's why there's so many overseas players for the Sunwolves. And again, that's the failure of both the Japanese union and the Super Rugby system in general. It's a heavily flawed system, and it's badly run. That's why the Southern Hemisphere nations are bleeding players to Europe and, to a certain extent, Major League Rugby for those sort of younger players or those slightly older players near the end of their careers. They're going to the Northern Hemisphere. The money's running out. There's half-filled stadiums, so they're not selling enough tickets. TV companies don't want to have it on their coverage. So look at Australia as an example. The NRL and AFL have channels devoted solely to NRL, solely to AFL. The Super Rugby, it's just there as an option. I mean, Christ, the V8 Supercars gets more viewers than Super Rugby. And then you have to look at the developmental leagues below, the national competition, the Shoot Shield. It's a joke. The quality level is not there. The depth isn't there. And you look at the comparison. I've done this comparison before between Rugby League in Australia and Rugby Union, and more young kids see League, and they know they have a better chance of getting a decent wage at the lower to mid levels, let alone NRL level. There's more chance of them getting into a professional or semi-pro team. The quality level is higher, and a lot of kids, when they hit 18, they might have been at a Rugby Union playing school and they switch codes. So Rugby Australia is losing youth players, and that's been an issue for 20 plus years. Cooper Cronk is a prime example of a player who played Union at school, and at the age of 18 went, "Now I'm going to play League. Melbourne Storm have offered me a contract through their developmental system. I'm going to play League now." Cooper Cronk is the example of a Rugby Union player who turned his back on the sport and turned to Rugby League when he turned 18. And I keep using that as an example because that was nearly 20 years ago. And you look at it now with the Israel Folau saga, the Western Force still going as a team, but in a lower competition, the Shoot Shield becoming so uncompetitive and so one-sided, it's all up and down. There's no balanced scoring. It's either blowouts or really poor games, and bleeding of players to Europe and North America. That is the state of Rugby Union in Australia. The money's running out. The game is mismanaged. And you've got a big lawsuit coming in Australia. So, yeah, it's not just an Australian issue. Rugby Union, the professional era hasn't been all roses. The promised land, as they say. It's been a very... There's a lot of hidden issues within Rugby Union at professional level, and Rugby League has got issues as well. It's to do with money. It's to do with the distribution of money and the governance. But no, it's a mess. The Super Rugby is an absolute mess. The Jaguares in Argentina. How long do they stick around for? With the Sunwolves being dumped pretty quickly and unceremoniously. Yeah. It comes back to my initial, the question about the Newcastle United takeover, money, and players getting greedy. Israel Folau has just shown his pure greed. He's going to get a payday out of this, be it out of court settlement or he actually wins the lawsuit and gets paid damages of 10 million. Australian dollars, which will cripple Rugby Australia for maybe ever. The sport, not just in Australia, but not just in Australia, but in the Southern Hemisphere as a whole, has a money issue. There are money issues, and New Zealand does have a money problem as well. So the All Blacks, there is going to come a point where the money issue catches up to them as well. If the Super Rugby goes to the skids, which it could do, if Rugby Australia collapses, it could absolutely go to the skids. Then does that mean the All Blacks are still competitive? That means they're still number one team. They can produce great players. They can't afford to pay them. And again, the Kiwis are bleeding players to Europe. The South Africans are bleeding players to Europe. Argentinians, the Italy, Argentina, Spain kind of connection. Yeah, the Argentinians are starting to lose players to Europe again. So yeah, it's happening. And part of the problem with that is the national selection policies, especially of New Zealand and Australia, and the fact that there's more money in the French and English top divisions, and to a certain extent in some clubs in the Pro 14 to a point, there's more money. The players can get paid better salaries as an overseas player, like a marquee overseas player kind of thing, than back at home. And we can look at the issue with Tonga, Fiji, and Samoa, and the rugby nations. How the World Rugby wants to change how the rugby internationals works, the world rankings and stuff, and who gets money, and that's gone down like a lead balloon, those proposed changes. And yeah, there are issues in the sport, absolutely. And while rugby union is a religion in South Africa and New Zealand, and their second tier, the Currie Cup and the ITS Cup, are of a better standard than Australia's domestic Shoot Shield, it's still not great. Especially in Australia, rugby union is so far down the pecking order when it comes to other professional sports, both quality and the salaries you can get at the national level below Super Rugby is nowhere near the same as AFL and NRL. The average player gets paid a better wage in those competitions and in those sports in Aussie rules and rugby league over rugby union, and that's why they're bleeding players at youth level to the other codes. It is what it is, and it's an issue in the Southern Hemisphere, whereas the Northern Hemisphere rugby league is the weaker partner out of the two. So rugby league is stronger in Australia and to a certain extent New Zealand, whereas it's the reverse here in the Northern Hemisphere. It's the other way around. It's rugby union that's better off and rugby league that's struggling. So it's interesting how different ends of the planet across the world, the issues are the same. It's just the sports are swapped round, the codes are swapped round, but. No, the Super Rugby issues, yeah, they will affect the All Blacks eventually, whether it's this World Cup or 4 years' time. There will be a knock-on effect, absolutely. There is no hiding from that. There's no debating that. It's a known fact that the money is running out in Super Rugby, and Super Rugby is so badly run right now, and fans are rightly saying this is a mess. How long Super Rugby can keep going is questionable, and Rugby Australia, with this ongoing legal issue with Israel Folau, could be the defining moment of rugby union in the Southern Hemisphere for a generation. I don't think we've seen a player so divisive. We've seen Campese was a bit difficult in Australian rugby union. There's a few players who've had some colourful off-field excursions around the world, but this could be the defining moment of a generation for the sport worldwide, because it will set a precedent over the code of conducts that various federations can put in place, and also will set a precedent, on the payout awarded to a player over dismissal claims if he's on a centralised contract, be it with a club contract or a centralised contract through a union and a club. So yeah, it definitely will have an impact on future trade, working relations between players and the sport. And the franchise model, absolutely. The Israel Folau case could have much wider implications, not just for Israel Folau and Rugby Australia, but for the game as a whole worldwide. And we haven't even got on to other sports that have issues with player contracts and defining moments for that particular sport or that particular league. I mean, we could look at the NHL and officiating, and I haven't even got on to that yet, and how the playoffs this year have been absolutely diabolically officiated. From game one between the Jets and the Blues on the second day of the playoffs. The only game I've actually watched in an entirety of the playoffs. Some of the worst officiating I've seen for years in the NHL. A lot of sports are reaching their kind of judgment day in a sense, where what happens in the next couple of weeks and off seasons or the next few months will define the direction a sport will take for the next 25, 30, 40 years. The NRL is having the issue now with player behaviour and the code of conduct. Rugby Union, Israel Folau, the NHL officiating, the Premier League, the Mike Ashley, attempted to sell Newcastle and the fit and proper persons test and the TV rights. There are so many things happening now in professional sport that is the judgment day. This is going to affect how sport is seen over the next 25 years, how sport is run, how we as fans access it, because there's a growing disquiet amongst fans of professional sport that they've had enough of being milked and ripped off. And you look at some of the athletes getting greedier and greedier, and some of the owners of teams and leagues and getting greedier and greedier, and fans pretty much saying, nah, enough's enough. We're not willing to pay anymore. You've taken enough of our money, And Super Rugby's like that, because Super Rugby can't fill out its stadiums. It doesn't have a good TV deal in some countries. It's getting watched less and less. People are switching off, and it's no surprise that Rugby Australia is already in financial difficulty long before Israel Folau decided to take them to court. Israel Folau is a symptom of the greed of the athlete, and Rugby Australia is a symptom of the mismanagement of the sport. Professional sports and the TV deal, because the Australian broadcasters want to pretty much relegate Super Rugby to and the Shoot Shield off TV. They're more interested in the NRL and AFL than Super Rugby. And Super Rugby, I think, has been mismanaged for a very, very long time. But is what it is. I mean, we could debate the issues with Super Rugby and the history of Super Rugby on a video. We could look at the foundation of Super Rugby through to the issues that Super Rugby faces, and a lot of it is to do with money and TV deals and striking a decent balance, because professionalism in rugby union hasn't necessarily been a bed of roses. It's starting to show a lot of cracks and issues within the sport across the world. I think there is an issue with the fact the sport is fully professional now at the top levels. Whereas in the US, it's working really well with Major League Rugby, and they're showing, and it shows professionalism can work as long as it's supported by big business can get involved and sponsor, and you get the right ownership and the right direction for a sport. It shows it can work. Super Rugby showing the bad side of it, where it's going off track, and then the Northern Hemisphere is showing that they're trying to copy too much of the franchise model of Super Rugby and the North American sports, while still having that kind of club dynamic. And so there's three different ways of the sport being played, and it's striking the balance. But it is what it is, and we can discuss the state of rugby union in a variety of videos. But I think rugby union is at a crossroads in its future and its direction of the direction it takes. Player welfare is a big issue. Centralised contracts. Israel Folau is dominating the rugby union kind of news wires at the moment, but it's sort of deflecting attention away from the attempted restructure of the international calendar with this new Nations Championship kind of thing, and changing how the ranking system works, and how tier 2 nations are pretty much threatening to boycott the World Cup, and especially Pacific nations, and issues with financing of the sport at lower levels. And it deflects away from the success that Major League Rugby has been, and the North and the Americas Championship has been. And there's a whole host of issues that are going on, and fans have basically said, they're an educated fan base, have pretty much summed up the situation with their apathy. But there you go. It is what it is. I mean, there are other things we could look at and discuss. I mean, we could look at, the NHL officiating in this year's playoffs has been diabolical, worse than last year. For I think every team has had at least that one game which has been shockingly officiated, and every series has had that more than one questionable decision that is mind-boggling to a point. I think you've got to look at the officiating in this year's playoffs and how shoddy it has been. from the first game of the first round to now. It has been pretty diabolical, and fans demanding action be taken about the quality of officiating in the playoffs. But we had this debate last year with goalie interference. What is goalie interference? Oh God, look, I've had a bit of hockey fatigue lately. I'm not watching as much of the playoffs as I did last year, and I haven't really been as invested. Partly because my team were knocked out in the first round, but I had that fatigue where I watched too many games. The last couple of years, I've pretty much watched the NHL and to a certain extent the Elite League, and I've watched the World Championships, and of course watched the National League here in the UK. Pretty much solidly for pretty much the last 4 years, and you've reached a point where you're going, I'm getting a bit tired. I'm flagging a little bit. I need a little bit of a wind down. But I have noticed the officiating standards over the last 4 years in the playoffs have been diabolical. And last year, the Elite League, being in the headlines for really poor Department of Player Safety needing to be restructured, and some of the shocking decisions in the Elite League last year were highlighted in that Sheffield Belfast game that involved, the hit, the headshot, the kick out, all that kind of went across the North Atlantic to the east coast of the US and Canada, and they were talking about it on the period breaks at the Rangers game. So yeah, the Elite League and the National League refereeing last season, 2017-2018. So when I say last season, I mean last year and the year before, were highlighted and say, look, we look bush league, we look pretty amateur. And we are a lower quality league. I'm not denying that. The refereeing standards aren't as high because it's a smaller league. It's a growing, developing league. The NHL, the best league in the world, some of the worst officiating I've seen since the early 90s as a kid. And I've rewatched old games from the 80s and 90s, and I would tell you now, I think the officiating is nowhere near as good as what it was 20, 30 years ago, when the refs had their names printed on the back of their shirts so you knew who was refereeing a game. The NHL and the Stanley Cup playoffs this year has not been great quality. But last season, it was the goalie interference and what is and isn't offside. That was the big debating point 12 months ago. We saw a lot of missed calls when it came to goalie interference. This year, it's just been some really obvious foul play that isn't being called for every team. Players are getting away with a lot. And had the refs been calling that in the regular season and been consistently bad, I don't think the complaining would be as high. But the thing is, they've refed the regular season completely differently to the postseason, and that is really riled up a lot of fans. Of every playoff team, all 16 fan bases that made the playoffs, every team has been on the receiving end of what I can only describe as the most lackluster refereeing performances from linesmen and refs that I have seen in my lifetime. But when I was a small kid, I didn't fully understand everything that happened, but I was a fan of the game. Now that I'm so much older and I've watched so much hockey in the last 4 or 5 years, I can definitely say when the NHL has a foobar like this, a little screw up like this, with the standard of refereeing, other leagues that are lower down the pecking order will follow, and it will have a knock-on effect going across the world. If the NHL leads, other leagues will follow suit. And if the NHL is not taking a lead, other leagues will follow that lack of direction. And fans are screaming for change. Now, this is where the NHL cannot be knee-jerk reactionary. They have to get it right. If they get it wrong, and they have a reactionary policy, which they tend to do, it could negatively impact the game. But the standards, if you've got a rule book, use it. If you're going to call a penalty in period 1 of game 1 of the regular season a certain way, that call has to be the same in game 7, period 3, the last 30 seconds of the Stanley Cup final. And it's not been consistently applied from game 1, minute 1 of game 1 of the regular season to the last minute of the game 7, for example, in the Stanley Cup final. It's not. And this is the problem. And this off-season has been possibly the worst off-season. The criticism on social media by journalists, by experts, by ex-players. And when an ex-player who's played, it doesn't matter if it's 1 game in the NHL or 1,000, is coming out and saying the officiating standard is absolutely diabolical this time round, worse than last year, worse than the year before. And last year wasn't great. There was some really bad missed calls last year. Not in every game, but the odd game here or there. That says to me that there is an issue with NHL officiating, and that comes from the top. That comes from the head of officials. The person in charge of the officiating department is not doing his due diligence and his job, but that also comes from the Department of Player Safety not going right after the event, going, that guy should be suspended for that hit. Regardless if the refs have called a penalty and a penalty on the play or not, the Department of Player Safety isn't doing enough either. Zdeno Chara is skating around with a broken jaw and he cannot talk. His mouth is wired shut. He is drinking through a tube. He can't even eat properly. I admire him for, taking the ice in Game 5 and playing on with such a severe injury, but he shouldn't be in that situation. And Zdeno Chara is a big bloke. He's one of the hardest guys to flatten, and he's going around with badly broken jaw. That tells you all you need to know about the standard of officiating, because the player who did that to him is not suspended. So that's the Department of Player Safety and the referees department has failed this playoffs, and that's every fan base. I'm not being a salty Jets fan because we dished out some pretty not decent play this season. We had players suspended this season. I'm not defending any of our past or current players. But the standard of officiating between the regular season and now, there was times in the regular season where it wasn't great either. But in this playoffs, from Game 1 to I think it's going to be Game 5 of the Stanley Cup Final, has been not good enough throughout. And I've only watched passing bits of the playoffs. I haven't really been invested as much this year, partly because my team got knocked out pretty early on in the Jets, but everything I'm reading, all the media reports, ex-players on Twitter, fans, especially fans, they are really not happy. And when you have fans of both sides going, that was a shocking reffing performance, more than, that was a great game, that was an entertaining game, better luck next time, in the next round. We'll see it in the game 3 or game 4. When fans of both teams in a series are going, that was a show, that tells you all you need to know about the standard of officiating. When fans of both sides in a series are agreeing the referees are appalling, it just sums up the state of play. There are issues there. Let's see what the NHL does postseason. Let's see if there's what happens, because a lot of referees have been pulled from the playoffs. So that means the refereeing pool, the officiating pool, has actually shrunk over this playoffs rather than stayed at a decent size. So they've got less refs and linesmen to choose from who are available to officiate because of some bad performances. And that's the officials getting punished. Are they all at fault? No, I think there is a lack of leadership at the top. And we'll have to see what happens in the post Stanley Cup Final, post Game 7 or Game 6, depending if the Blues can win on Sunday or if it goes to a Game 7. We'll have to see what happens with the direction, because if every fan base has been super critical, and most fan bases are in agreement for the most part, it says that there is an issue there. It does say, there is an issue going on. And there needs to be something addressed, but it needs to be done constructively, not reactively. If the NHL are very reactionary in how they deal with a poor refereeing display over this postseason, it could make the situation worse for next postseason and the next regular season. So, there's a lot. They have to be very, very careful how they, deal with all this. But I think there needs to be consistency in refereeing with the regular season and postseason. The calls should be the same. If they be making the calls consistently for high stick or holding or hooking or charging or whatever the penalty may be, they have to apply that in the postseason and vice versa. What's a penalty in period 1 of Game 1 of the regular season should still be a penalty in Game 7 of the Stanley Cup Final in the last 30 seconds. There should be no difference. Not in my eyes. It's got to the point now where there's too much leeway and lack of consistency that it is affecting the outcome of series. It is affecting fans' perception of the sport, and it's not a good PR. It's not good PR for the NHL at a time when they're trying to get as much positive PR as possible, and they're trying to avoid a potential lockout. They need as much positive PR as possible going into the next season and a bit, 2 seasons, because they're trying to get the Seattle fan base, the new Seattle, whatever the team is going to be on side, grow the game into the state of Washington, and they want to keep the fans from Vegas. And if you've got negative PR like this, it's not a good look. for a league that wants to grow and expand and grow the fan base, it's not a good look. But the same could be said about the NBA and their postseason and the refereeing of the NBA. There's been some questionable decisions since over the last 10 years since the betting scandal broke and there was all that came out. So professional sports and refereeing standards have been under the spotlight for a while now. But when they're that bad, you have to wonder: is it the refs are just incompetent, or if there's like match fixing involved? Because that's the debate that I've seen on Twitter. There was one media commentator from Canada who went, "Are the refs that incompetent, or is there much darker forces at play?" And I put down the joke, "Oh, the fix is in." And there were a lot of responses going, "Actually, are you joking or being serious?" So, well, I'm actually joking, but if I was being serious, would you have been able to tell the difference? Well, I know. There are people questioning the integrity of the NHL over the standard of refereeing at the highest level. Whereas the World Championships in Slovakia, there were one or two bad calls, but for the most part, the refereeing standard in Slovakia in the World Championships was top notch. I know the game is a different style of hockey; it's a bit less physical, it's skill based, but the standard of refereeing in the World Championships in Slovakia completely different. I watched a lot of the World Championship games. The standard of refereeing was far better than the NHL playoffs. Compare game one of the Jets versus the Blues in round one versus Great Britain USA, which I watched in the entirety. So I'm comparing to an international game and a Stanley Cup game, which is pretty much the same intensity level if you think about it. The refereeing standard in the USA GB game was far higher than the refereeing standard in the first round, the first game of the first round of the NHL playoffs. In my personal opinion, there were a lot of missed calls in the Jets Blues, and there were some really head scratching calls in that game one, which are nowhere near as egregious as some of the missed calls and some of the dodgy calls that we've seen as the playoffs have progressed. But you know, if you can see that you've got NHL level and quality players playing and NHL quality refs reffing, or call them elite level referees in an international competition and a club competition, and the international competition is actually refereed at a far higher standard than possibly a bigger competition in the Stanley Cup finals, that tells you all you need to know. And yeah, the integrity of the NHL is being questioned. But again, I digress. I don't want to get too bogged down in refereeing standards. You know, I've been arguing about, you know, are we putting too much pressure on officials? You know, are they being held to account enough? And I've been, you know, looking at it from all angles and trying to be as fair as possible. But I will say this: the standard this year is not as good as last year, and last year was questionable at times, even in the regular season. And we obviously had that period of about 3 months where we didn't even know what goaltender interference was, because you could slash a goalie in the head with a high stick and not get called 2 minutes or even a major penalty for it. So, you know, the standard of NHL officiating has been a hot topic for a couple of years, if not longer. And we'll have to wait and see, you know, what transpires. I will say this: the elite league, the refereeing standard this year was a lot better than last season. So this season just gone was better than the season before. I will admit the elite league standard refereeing has improved over the last 12 months. Absolutely. It's still not as good as it could be, but it has improved. And I will say this: that the level of refereeing in the National League was better than the season before. So the quality of reffing in British ice hockey has improved. There is a long way to go, but at the top level in the NHL, there are massive issues, and a lot of fans of all teams are just left head scratching. And those who are neutrals, whose teams never made it to the playoffs, just want to watch the Stanley Cup playoffs. You know, they are hockey fans who've got no dog in the race, no horse in the race. They're neutrals. They're left scratching their heads, going, "Why is that a penalty? Why is that not a call?" No, the whole thing. So hockey fans around the world, outside North America, but around the world, are in agreement that the Stanley Cup playoffs have been poorly refed this year. Absolutely, but it is what it is, and we move on, and we'll see if Game 6 is refereed as badly as Game 5, and if it goes to Game 7, how Game 7 is officiated, because the debate's there. It's not going away. But again, you know, we could look at the Women's World Cup first match tonight, 4 hours it kicks off, and we can debate how much or how has the refereeing improved from the Euros 2 years ago, or is it worse on the global stage? We can have that debate, and I know women's sport gets is hot topic at the moment over at the quality level, but we had it last year with the VAR in the World Cup. Was it one of the better refereed tournaments? Yeah. The World Cup last year, the Football World Cup last year in Russia was one of the better refereed World Cups and Euros, those kind of tournaments that I've seen for quite some time. We could look at some of the Champions League finals or Europa League finals or some of the group stages, some of the European games we've seen at club level and go, there was some shocking refereeing there. I mean, the scrutiny that the officiating of professional sports is under, it is there. And some of them are under more scrutiny than others because the quality level is deemed to be not as high as what it was the year before or 10 years ago. We could have the same debate about the English Premier League right now and officiating. We could have a debate about World Rugby's officiating, Rugby League. The debate about professional sports officiating and team sports has been going on for decades. But now with social media, more TV angles, better quality TV angles, better quality, general images, the debate is there more. And with the right and VAR and use of it and with the rise of social media, the debate is bigger than what it was 10, 15 years ago. More people have a say. But as someone who's been watching a lot of professional sport over the years, and as someone who's followed especially rugby league and ice hockey and football so religiously, partly for the channel, but partly because rugby league, ice hockey, and to a certain extent rugby union are my favourite sports. Ice hockey, rugby league, and union in that order. I've seen some pretty diabolical officiating in European club rugby. I've seen some pretty diabolical officiating and confusing officiating in rugby league, in Super League, Challenge Cup, and NRL level. And I've seen some pretty diabolical refereeing in the NHL in the regular season, let alone the postseason. But I've also seen some very, very good officiating. So it depends from official to official. Do we look at individual referees and individual linesmen and individual, video refs and go, that one's a good referee. He or she calls the game very, very well. And we look at another one and go, that he or she are not as good. Because that's what, there are certain referees who become household names. Ben Thaler in rugby league. I know who he is. Am I a fan of his? No, I think he's over whistle happy, and I think he blows the whistle too frequently, and he gives some really head scratching penalties. Chechen in the NRL not giving a TMO review for Tonga against England. It should have been a knock on against England. It should have been a scrum Tonga, and it should have been a Tongan try in the World Cup semi final 2 years ago. You could look at some of the football referees, like Mark Clattenburg, points in his career was questionable, but other times he was very, very good. At points, there are some officials who are very good and others who are very bad. And it's variable across the league. There's no consistency because you also have interpretation of the rule book. So it's the referee's interpretation of the laws of the game. It's the video ref's interpretation of what is handball, what is a knock on, what is offside, what is a hit to the head. It's also down to the video ref's interpretation as well. And I think that's where we've got to look at interpretation over what the wording of a rule is. And that's a thing across sport. That's a topic across sport is interpretation of the rule book. And I think that's part of the reason why the NHL is having the issue it's having. It's part of the reason why rugby league across Super League to NRL to international level has 3 different rule sets. And that's confusing as hell. The fact that the Super League, the play the ball rules different and there's 1 ref, NRL, the play with the ball rules evolved and there's 2 refs, and then international rules, you can still fight. They need to have a more consistent rule book for rugby league. Ice hockey, the NHL and IIHF have different rule books because the ice surface is different and the size of the ice is different. And each individual league has its own separate rule that it puts in for certain things like late hit, charging. They're both the same thing, but they're worded differently and they're both in the rule book. 2-line offside pass. It's gone now, but it's still in the rule book. It's been superseded by a new rule. It's bizarre. you also have the women's game in ice hockey is refereed differently to the men's. Whereas in other sports, rugby union, rugby league, and football, for example, and cricket, it's exactly the same. It's just in women's cricket, the boundaries are shorter. That's it. Women's ice hockey, no hitting, no fighting. Men's hockey, yeah, you can fight. You can check them hard. Not in the women's game. So again, there's a lot of debates to be had about officiating. But yeah, back to the Stanley Cup. No, it's been atrocious this year across the board. Take out referees' interpretation and the refereeing style. Some refs call a very loose, fluid game. Some referee pragmatically, and others ref by the book, whistle happy. I think it also depends on the atmosphere between the two sides and the tension there. If it's a pretty relaxed, not too intense, you just let the game flow. If you're a pragmatic ref, you will call the serious stuff, and if you're by the book, it just suits. It's refereeing with your head. Some refs just can't do that. But the amount of missed calls is worrying with the amount of camera angles we have and the amount of the fact that there's two ref system. It shouldn't happen. You've got 4 pairs of eyes on the ice, plus multiple pairs of eyes off the ice. It shouldn't happen. But we'll have to see what the NHL decides post-season to look at the situation. But they're not the only professional league or the only professional sport that has this issue. So it's an ongoing thing, pretty much. The Anthony, I think I'm going to end on this. Talk about money in sport. The Ruiz Jr. Joshua fight, more people watched it illegally than paid the pay-per-view. So that says all you need to know about what fans feel about the boxing promoters and in general paying, a subscription to get a sports channel that then you've got to pay to view again. So you're paying them double. It's that's what I'm going to end the stream on. I think we've reached a point where I think fans have had enough of paying through the nose. They've said enough, no more. Reduce prices or we stop watching. Make it free even. They make enough money off sponsors and adverts anyway. And I think fans have just said enough's enough now. We've had enough, and I can't blame them. I think boxing has reached a point now where they've milked the fans dry, and there's actually a dwindling fan base for pro boxing now. The fan base is starting to dwindle. There is that. But I think I'm going to leave that there because, to be honest, there's a break in the weather. I might go for a little wander, enjoy the sun while it is out, and then I'm going to watch the Women's World Cup this evening, and then we'll do a review on the France-South Korea women's game, and then we'll try and watch as much of the women's football as possible this weekend. And then, of course, England-Scotland's on Sunday. That's going to be a fun game, fun rivalry game in the Women's World Cup in the group stages. That's a great thing to look forward to. And, of course, we've got Game 6, the Stanley Cup Finals, on Sunday. We've had the aftermath of State of Origin, and there are question marks about the selection of the halves for State of Origin, and we've got the bye weeks in the NRL, and we'll have to have a look at the NRL standings after the bye weeks are done and when the Origin period's done, and we'll have to look at the standings as they stand now, and then we'll have to look at the standings of the NRL post Origin and see which team is most adversely affected on things. The Champions League final, I don't think there's a point now. It's been and done. I fell asleep during the game. I didn't watch enough of the game to really have an opinion. Champions League final's been and gone. We're focusing now on the Women's World Cup. We're focusing now on the French Open final. We've got State of Origin 2 coming up. I think in a couple of weeks. We've got I think the British Touring Cars is back this weekend. The F1's back in Montreal this weekend. Although I don't give a toss about the F1. I got bored of it a long time ago. There's a lot of sport coming up. Andy Murray's aiming to make his tennis return at Queen's in the doubles, so his time as a singles player may be over. But the Women's World Cup starts tonight. I'm going to look at that. That's going to be kind of fun. I think women's sport needs that kind of a positive, and if the Women's World Cup can be entertaining at least, the quality level is not going to be there. The effort and the passion is going to be there, and it's going to be kind of fun to see how well they do as a group, as the whole tournament, and what the crowds are like as well. If the crowds are pretty decent, that's a healthy sign that the game is going in the right direction. But what I'm concerned about the Women's World Cup is not the quality of play or the refereeing standards or the fact that there's going to be a lot of one-sided games. It's the quality of pitches. Because 3 years ago in the Euros, those pitches were really not up to scratch. The same pitches they're playing on now 3 years ago were really below par. So it's going to be interesting to see the quality of the surface, considering that professional players now are so mollycoddled. They expect perfect, pristine snooker table type pitches. So it's going to be interesting. The NRL, we are going to, have a look at the NRL standings after this weekend because the bye weeks start. And then we're going to look at the standings post Origin because that will tell us which teams are most affected by state of origin. Another thing I forgot to mention, obviously, the Leeds Chiefs have got an ice hockey team now. Leeds got an ice hockey team. It's going to be interesting to see how their squad looks when the season starts and what players they get in for that squad. That's going to be really interesting to see what their squad looks like and how competitive they are off the bat when the season starts. That's going to be fun to look at with the Leeds Chiefs as well. Israel Folau, will he actually take him to court, or is it just a threat? We've seen how the Israel Folau situation is progressing, but Rugby Australia has got a lot of issues. We'll have to see what happens there. The Women's World Cup, we'll have to see what happens tonight between South Korea and France. The French are the favourites for that game. There are going to be a lot of one-sided games. I think the gulf between the top nations in women's football and then the middle is not too bad, but the middle batch and the rest, there is a gap there. But we saw some pretty one-sided games at this Men's World Cup just gone. We've seen them at many World Cups over the years. It's just a bit more accentuated in the women's game because of the lack of professionalism in a lot of countries and the very few countries that have professional leagues and professional players. On saying that, the USA have some issues. The Australian team, their coach got fired for various reasons, political correctness, it seems. The Germans aren't the force they once were. This is the best chance for England and the women's game, at least, to win a World Cup and in general a World Cup. If Phil Neville's team can do it, that will be a shot in the arm for the women's game in this country and worldwide. And and then the debate about equal pay will come up. I have no doubt. I also hope there's not too many one-sided games, but I like seeing a lot of goals. I like seeing really open football. I think if the weather is like it has been today over the south of England, like it was in France over the last few days, if we have that kind of changeable conditions, that can have a massive impact. If the pitches are like what they were 3 years ago for the men's Euros, it could be a leveler where those skilled teams, those higher ranked teams like the Dutch, like New Zealand, like England, USA, Germany, the Scandinavian nations, if the weather has an effect, that could be a leveler, and some of these lower ranked nations could have a chance to get a scrappy goal, and it could level the playing field. But we'll have to see. I mean, at the end of the day, it's an international competition, and it's a chance for England and Scotland as well to take some silverware home. And that England-Scotland game in the group stage is going to be a feisty encounter. Even though a lot of the Scottish and English players are teammates at club level, it's going to be a feisty encounter. And the fact that now the game is professional in this country, the standard should be better than what it was 4 years ago. The quality should be improving because more and more women are playing the game professionally. And the debate about equal pay will not go away. So if the tournament is a success, it doesn't matter who wins. Personally, for me, I mean, I would love to see England or Wales, a home nation, take the trophy home. Scotland, sorry. But whoever wins the tournament, the quality of women's football has improved. There is a long way to go. I don't think it's reached its full potential yet, and there's a lot of detractors of the women's game, and I think that's wrong. I think there's less diving, there's less faking, simulation. That they're not afraid to tackle. Tackling hasn't gone out the women's game like it has the men's, and because they're paid less, they're playing for the love of the game more. I think there's a little bit more pride and passion in a performance. The quality level will come eventually. It will take time. It's not going to happen overnight. And some of these detractors are I don't think have the right mindset about why the situation is what it is. And when players like Fran Kirby are coming out and ex-players like Hope Solo, who I can't stand, by the way, I don't like Hope Solo because of her off-field antics, but when ex-women's players and current players are saying the debate about women's pay in the game and either closing the pay gap or making it equal is there, I do think they're not fully seeing the full economics, because if they were to get equal pay with an average men's, professional side, the game would be bankrupt. But that debate's there, and finding a solution to make the women's game better quality overall and improve the quality level, which is coming, but B, making sure that when the quality does improve and the crowds do improve, that they are paid a fair wage and get a fair TV deal. There are reasons why women's sport is lagging behind men's, and it's partly to do with fans not really buying in and the quality level not being there. Now, as the game is now professional, it will improve. But we've been here before with women's ice hockey in Canada and the US, and the Canadian Women's League going out of business this postseason, this year, literally a few weeks ago. It was a professional league. It wasn't making any money. The women's NBA, they're paid a decent wage. They're not making much money. And how many women's NBA players can you name, past or present? I can't name a single NBA player from the women's NBA. Men's NBA, past and present, I can name a hatful of players. Not that I follow the NBA, but I know who they are. Women's NBA, the WNBA, I couldn't name you a single player. I could not name you a single player that plays women's basketball in the women's NBA. They're paid decent money. They get more a year than I do, so they actually are paid a decent wage. But I don't even know who Liz Jackson is. So we could debate, and they're demanding better pay, but that's suicide, because that will bankrupt their league. It's the same with the Canadian Women's Ice Hockey League going out of business. They weren't getting paid a lot anyway, and the league was not profitable in a country where ice hockey is the national sport. They could not make nearly enough money. They just were making no money. They were making as a league as a whole was making a loss. So there's your issue that Fran Kirby is raised. She wants equal pay for women's players, but the game is not at that level yet where the quality level is high enough that enough fans want to buy in. The average crowd is not big enough for a club game. Internationals is different. It's your national side. Regardless if it's men or women, you're going to support your national team. But when it comes to club football, women's level, there's not the fan base there worldwide to justify getting paid as much as they want to get paid, because the sport will bankrupt itself. It'll be out of business within hours. Less than a day, it will be done. There'll be not enough money because the TV deals aren't there, the sponsorship deals aren't there, and the quality level isn't there. Until the quality level improves markedly, and there is a long way to go, it's not going to be sustainable for the wages they want. And that's me being a fair economic assessment. That's not me being a sexist or anything like that. That's telling it how the facts are. Until the quality level improves to a point where fans want to buy in, the women's game will not be on the same level as the men's, period. But for pay, there's not a hope in hell that they're going to get what they want. It's because the quality level isn't there, and the fan base is not there yet. But this World Cup could go a long way to improve the image of women's football, especially if one of the home nations does really well, like England or Scotland. I mean, if they do really, really well, then that can go a long way to change the perception in this country, at least. But it's like the Australian women's team. As you say, their coach was sacked. And I mean, I wanted to end the live stream a while ago, but sod it, I'll keep going as more people keep joining. The Australian women's coach was sacked over political correctness or whatever crap it was, and there's a lot of PC kind of forces going on. But when you've got players saying we expect, we want equal pay, the women's game just does not have the finance to sustain that kind of level of output financially. It will bankrupt the league. It would bankrupt the sport. And there's enough issues within the women's game anyway, getting enough girls interested in participating, supporting, coaching, working within the sport as a general rule, be it as administrators, coaches, physios, officials, go from the club shop all the way up to the boardroom, to ownership. Be it on the men's side or women's side, there's not enough interaction yet, and the quality level will come eventually, where the quality level improves to its peak potential, where it cannot improve anymore. We've reached the physical perfection that a female football player can be, fitness and skill level and quality and power of shot and tackle and ability. We're not there yet. we haven't found the perfect women's football player yet. We've had it in the men's game. We've had about a million probably players, hundreds of thousands of players. We came Pele as the ultimate team player. We could name Cruyff as the ultimate innovator. We've got Maradona, the ultimate enigma. We've got Messi and Ronaldo, the current greatest all-time debate, which they're not, by the way. They're just not. Fact. We've had, Hurst, the only guy to score a World Cup final hat-trick. We in the men's game, we can name so many players in their position or in their era who are still, even then, with the old leather balls and old heavy boots, are still of a higher quality than the women's game currently is. The thing with Gazza is he's a flawed individual. We're not at the stage where we've got that true, perfect, ultimate professional who's not only in the women's game ultimately skilled or ultimately powerful or ultimately the physique, the muscular tone and everything like that, but also as an ambassador. Because when you've got people like Hope Solo as a commentator, her off-field track record is pretty shoddy with child abuse allegations and a whole host of other issues, legal. We're not at the stage where we can say that's the female Messi, that's the female Ronaldo, that's the female Pele. We're not at that stage yet. We're not at the stage to say, okay, this is the ultimate player of all time for the women's game. Also, the quality level is nowhere near as high as it could be. There is still growth in the game. And for those detractors, they want it to fail. And when high-profile players in the women's game come out and say they want equal pay, they're not going to get it. They are deluded in the fact that they've been drip-fed this PC crap, which is going to bankrupt the sport. And then they wonder why they're out of a job in 6 months' time when the sport collapses on itself. But look, I think their pay will go up. The quality level will improve with the rise of professionalism. The leagues will become more profitable. Absolutely. But are they going to get the same amount of money as men? No. Partly because the men's game is overinflated anyway and has gone too far overpaid, overboard. But they're not going to get what the men get. The men's game, mainstream football has, I think the money's gone too far. I think they need to come back a little bit, a lot, from what the women are demanding. Oh, God, no. Absolutely not. Men play netball. I know of men who've played netball. They're not even close to. Again, it's like I think tennis is possibly the closest sport you can get where you've got mixed doubles, and badminton, where you have the mixed competitions. Horse racing and eventing in equestrian sports, motorsport to a point with certain formula where you actually have female drivers or female jockeys or female tennis players competing alongside men. That's the closest you're going to get to a sport where you're going to have parity in some way, shape, or form. Other sports like team sports, where you're playing all as women against a full women's team, you're going to get paid equal to your opposition. You're not going to get paid to your male equivalent. I think curling, is another sport that has mixed doubles or mixed teams. But as I say, not every sport has that mixed dynamic. Tennis, badminton, I think squash, motorsport in certain formula, there's a good mix there. But less women participate in motorsport than men anyway. There's less interest of women to be involved in motorcycle and car racing than men. It's a known fact. There are some pretty good women, motor racing drivers and motorbike riders out there who have competed against amateur and professional level and have won and got podiums and been competitive. Absolutely, I completely understand that. But the interest from women just isn't there for that kind of, we all want to do it. There's only a very small percentage of a motor racing paddock that are women who drive or ride. It's about 0.2%. The fan base may be there, but the actual, I want to actually do this as a job is limited. NASCAR, you can watch it on YouTube. NASCAR YouTube channel. That's where you can get your NASCAR. You can watch all the races on YouTube. NASCAR itself, I don't actually know what channel it's on now. I think it might be on Premier Sports or Free Sport, but I honestly haven't really followed NASCAR this year. I follow it on YouTube. I don't follow it on the TV. But there you go. I mean, in the V8 supercars, you've got what's her name? You've got a female racer in the V8 supercars in Australia. So women do compete at the highest level in motorsport in the various formula and the various classes and the various competitions against men. But women's football, the debate about equal pay, Christ, they're not in a mixed. They're playing against women, so they should expect to be paid the same amount as their opposition. I think if you're going to have women football players paid the same amount as men, the sport will be bankrupt within hours. There's just not the interest there. Now, this World Cup could go a long way in building that interest and building that fan base, but we'll have to see what happens. It's the same with rugby union. It's the same with rugby league. That debate is not going away. It's a thing, but the economics say it's suicide to go down that route. It is suicide to demand money that isn't there within the sport they're demanding. But it is what it is. And yeah, I am going to be watching the Women's Football World Cup as much as possible. And the hours that I'm working at work mean it is highly possible that I can watch almost every single game, which is great. Which is great for the channel content because then I can do cover women's football. And I've covered a few games of women's football, but I can cover a whole bloody tournament, and that's something that I haven't done before with the women's sport. So I'm happy to do it. And I've looked at the data, and about 7% of my viewers all time are women. So there are female fans of sport out there. Not many, it seems. I think they're an underrepresented group, and I think online women hide their gender. They pretend they're men to avoid the sexism, to avoid the harassment. They put down on their YouTube channels that they're men when they're not. So I think the percentage could be a lot higher. But looking at my data, and I'm going to end on this, looking at my data, about 7 to 8% all time of my viewers identify as female. Because you can hide your identity really, really well on the internet to a point, especially on anonymous things where you just put a logo up and that's you. So if just under 10% are women of views all time, that's about 12,000 views of videos are female on this channel. That is some really positive. That's something positive to take from things that women are there, but over 90% of my viewership is male, and the viewership group most is 18 to 30. That's the viewership bracket. Those two, that 18-30 club is the big viewership there. That's where the majority of my viewers come from. Is the 18 to 34 age ranges, predominantly men. So sport is still pretty much a male preserve. But women do watch. And I'm going to have to look at the figures of what groups, age range especially, decide to watch. But the Women's World Cup can go a long way to build a sport and build an interest, especially if England and Scotland do really, really well. And other big sports markets like the US, like the Scandinavian countries where sport is really well followed, like the Germans, like the Australians, sports mad countries. If they do well, that can build a fan base, that can build the interest. And it's not about you joggers that go round and round and round. It's also about I normally lie in, except on Wednesdays when I'm rudely awakened by the bin man. Yeah, I like a bit of Part Life by Blur, but no, that's my thought. This Women's World Cup could do a lot to build the fan base and build the interest, and so I'm going to be covering it. I'm going to watch as many games as possible. I like watching international sport. I enjoy it more than club sport because you see more high quality players play. But anyway, I'm going to end that there, and I'll obviously be watching the Women's World Cup. Get kicked off, and I'll be watching as many games as possible, and it's going to be fun following it. And then there's other sports stuff to follow as well. We've got the French Open finals. We've got so there's going to be a new women's champion at the French Open. There you go. Rafael Nadal hammered Roger Federer in 3 sets, battered him. And Dominic Thiem versus Novak Djokovic today, and then we'll see if Djokovic can compete with Nadal, if it's Thiem to upset the apple cart. And then we got some motorsport. We've got aftermath of State of Origin 1. There's a lot going on. It's going to be fun. But I'm going to leave that. Thank you very much for watching. I know it's not the longest live stream, not the most interesting, but a lot of interesting points have been raised. And the big news is Israel Folau wants money, lots of money, and Rugby Australia could be bankrupt. So we'll have to see all the legal stuff from that and what happens and go from there. But anyway, thank you very much for watching. Bye for now. And later on this evening, there will be a match review of France, South Korea on the channel. And we'll go from there. So see you later. And by the way, Park Life.